Hello, and welcome to Dreamy Nights, a sanctuary where everyone can experience calm and a touch of magic before gently drifting into sleep. Tonight, we invite you on another enchanting journey, a story that helps soothe the mind and nurture a sense of peace. Before we begin, let's take a moment to prepare our bodies and minds for a comforting, restorative rest. Make yourself cozy, and with each slow inhale and long exhale, let the cares of the day gradually slip away. It's not always easy to step back from the day's demands, especially as night falls. Yet, remember, the less we worry about how quickly we'll fall asleep, the simpler it is for our minds to release any remaining tension. Allow the gentle flow of your breathing to wash away lingering concerns, and let the story ahead guide you into a state of deep relaxation. Now, settle in, and let the dreamy atmosphere softly wrap around you. Enjoy this story, and may you drift into a peaceful, restful slumber here on Dreamy Nights. Once, there was a merchant named Laurent who had risked his entire fortune on a fleet of ships, only to lose them all at sea. As a widower, he didn't have to face the burden of delivering this news to a wife, but he did have 6 children who were accustomed to a life of relative luxury. When the debts came due, and word spread that the family was destitute, most of them struggled to cope with the news. With each passing day, and no sign of the ships in the port, Laurent had no choice but to start selling off their elegant furniture, their carriage, and even his daughter's precious jewelry and lavish dresses. They were forced to abandon their opulent home and relocate to a modest cottage on the outskirts of town. Laurent spent much of his time away, seeking out business connections and potential investors to help him rebuild his enterprise. During his absences, his 3 sons and 3 daughters, though almost grown, were left to manage the household on their own. The boys and the 2 eldest girls, who were accustomed to a life of leisure and study, were of little help when it came to practical tasks. The youngest daughter, named Camille, displayed a willingness to take on the necessary chores around the house. Whether due to her more impressionable age or her gentle and steadfast nature, Camille diligently learned the essentials of running a household. Camille, who was well liked by the villagers, sought guidance from them on unfamiliar tasks like baking, sewing, gardening, and raising chickens. Initially cautious, the villagers grew fond of her as they witnessed her eagerness to learn and work hard. Over time, Camille became the linchpin that held Laurent's household together. While the older siblings grappled with accepting their new circumstances, Camille ensured that their home was orderly and that there was always food on the table. Nearly 2 years into their modest lifestyle, Laurent received news that one of his missing ships had reappeared in the port, with much of its cargo intact. The family celebrated this miraculous turn of events. The elder siblings were quick to declare an end to their life among the villagers. While Camille shared in their joy, she didn't seem as enthralled by the news as the others. She'd grown fond of their cozy cottage, with its well-kept garden and the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. Despite her relief at seeing her family content, she was uncertain about returning to their former life of idleness. She had discovered a sense of fulfillment in being of service. To reclaim his property, Laurent had to make a journey to the port on horseback, which would take a couple of days. Upon arrival, he planned to manage the distribution of his wealth and hire a comfortable coach for the journey back. In anticipation of their improved circumstances, he asked each of his children what gift they desired from the city. The older siblings requested luxurious items like silk shoes with sparkling buckles, hats with intricate decorations, velvet capes, bears, and jewels. Among them, Camille remained silent, appearing deep in thought about her desired gift. When prompted by her father, she hesitated briefly before expressing her wish. "Father, I have always dreamt of seeing a rose," she confessed. "Roses do not grow in our region, and they are both exotic and costly. If you could bring me a single rose in any color, that would be wonderful." Her father chuckled at his youngest daughter's peculiar request, but readily agreed. Privately, he also planned to bring her a necklace or some other trinket along with the flower. On the morning of his departure, the weather was pleasant. Camille packed his saddlebag with provisions for the journey and bid him farewell with a somewhat teary smile. The other children were less sentimental. Accustomed to their father's travels, they were solely interested in the gifts they anticipated upon his return. As Laurent rode off along the sunlit forest path, Camille alone lingered in front of the cottage until he vanished from sight. She felt a strange sense of unease, but chose to remain silent. After all, their fortune seemed to be on the rise. While Laurent's children awaited his return at the cottage, he steadily made his way to the port city, filled with hope of regaining his wealth and standing. Although he had indeed suffered significant losses, Laurent saw an opportunity with the cargo on the ship. He envisioned starting a new business, possibly expanding to create a fleet of ships. His mind was brimming with visions of importing spices, silks, and other goods in the future. His hopes were shattered when he arrived at the port. While the ship had returned with most of its cargo intact, news of his good fortune had spread rapidly, prompting his numerous creditors to act swiftly. By the time Laurent arrived to claim his possessions, they had already been seized to settle his debts. Despite his efforts to negotiate with the merchants for more time to pay off his substantial bills, his pleas fell on deaf ears. By day's end, he was debt-free but left with nothing. There was no capital for investment, and certainly no funds for the gifts he had promised his family. He was so disheartened that he didn't even want to stay in the city overnight. Without properly provisioning himself, considering the weather, or sending any correspondence ahead of him, Laurent mounted his tired horse again and rode out of town, heading back down the provincial road that had brought him to the port that morning. Laurent was a few hours outside of the city when darkness fell and a storm descended. Lightning and thunder crashed all around him, and the wind gusted mercilessly, blowing limbs off the trees. Laurent's horse became frightened and bolted away from the main road, taking him into an unfamiliar forest. Realizing too late that he had been foolish to undertake this nighttime journey, Laurent began searching in the gusting wind for any sort of shelter, such as a cave. How long his horse wandered through the howling gale, he did not know. Finally, he saw a tall stone wall arise before him. He urged the horse onward, hoping he had reached a house where he might shelter. Arriving at the forbidding wall of rock, he saw that it was not a house. It was the wall around an estate. A tall and imposing iron gate stood ever so slightly open. Having no time for good manners, Laurent dismounted and pushed the heavy swinging gate wider to pull his horse through. Together, they slowly headed up a paved walkway that receded ahead of them into the swirling darkness. With leaves flying all around and rain pelting him from all sides, Laurent could barely see the massive structure that emerged ahead of him in the wicked gloom. It was a mansion, to be sure. Although his visibility was limited, he could see it had a grand approach and many large rooms with tall windows. It was a very intimidating place for a person to arrive uninvited, but he had no choice. He feared he could not survive the night without a roof over his head. Tying his horse up safely in a sheltered alcove, he walked to the massive front door and lifted the iron door knocker. He let it fall, hearing the sound echo through the gloom, as if in response to the thunder. When there was no answer, he took a deep breath and pushed the door inward with all his weight. It gave, and he found himself almost falling onto the floor of a grand entryway. Laurent lay on the cold flagstones for a moment, regaining his breath in the eerie stillness. He could still hear the rain lashing the front steps through the crack in the tall door, and thought to himself how glad he was that he had found shelter for his horse. Rising in the semi-darkness, he appeared about him. He was in a grand reception area with a curved staircase ascending on either side. Suits of armor stood sentinel here and there. Ahead of him, there was a set of richly carved double doors. The silence within the house was profound, with a light glowing through the cracks of the doors in front of him, making it possible to hear a pin drop. Despite a few half-hearted attempts to call out, he eventually took a deep breath and approached the lighted room, slowly pushing the doors open. Inside, he found a room with a roaring fire and the cavernous hearth, and a table set for one with simple dishes, a carafe, and a large drinking glass. The room also contained upholstered chairs and tables stacked with books. Despite the absence of the owner, Laurent awkwardly sat down on an armchair and waited, unable to resist the temptation of the dinner laid out on the table. His hunger grew as he indulged in the meal, starting with a slice of bread and eventually finishing everything on the table. Convinced that the owner was away, he enjoyed the delicious liquid in the glass and then drifted off to sleep. Upon waking in the morning, Laurent found himself alone in the room, with the fire extinguished and the remnants of the previous night's meal still on the table. Realizing his intrusion, he decided to leave quietly rather than waiting for the owner to return. As he made his way out, the light filtering into the entryway illuminated the hallway more clearly than the night before. Entering the foyer with a sense of self-consciousness, he cautiously navigated between the vigilant suits of armor, half expecting them to spring to life and block his way. Observing the neglected and fussy carpet runners on the twin carving staircases, he realized that the residence seemed uninhabited for quite some time. Approaching the massive front door, he exerted all his strength to pull the handles, causing it to slowly slide open, revealing a misty courtyard outside. After slipping through the crack and closing the door behind him, he straightened his waistcoat, trying to regain composure. Although leaving the forbidding refuge felt unsettling, he resolved to put the humiliating journey behind him. Hurriedly returning to the alcove where his horse was tethered, he was relieved to find her in good condition. Retrieving an apple from his saddlebag, a remnant from the supplies Camille had packed, he fed it to his horse. Untying the horse, he silently led her along the stoned path he had traversed in the blustery wind the previous night. Glancing back, he beheld the imposing mansion looming in the increasing daylight. The vast chateau, long, beige, and rectangular, featured a central section flanked by identical wings on each side. The regimented appearance of the tall, narrow windows on the two large floors gave the impression of them scrutinizing him. The thickly populated chimneys adorned the sloping, tiled roof. Turning away from the sight of the grand chateau, he guided the horse towards the front gate, passing the overgrown gardens on either side. Approaching the end of the walkway, he noticed a charming pergola overrun with rose bushes. In the center of a circular seating area stood a rose bush adorned with the most exquisite pink roses he had ever seen. Recalling his promise to Camille, he decided to fulfill his commitment to his youngest daughter by cutting the blushing roses with a knife from his bag. Realizing one rose would not suffice to make amends for his sudden reappearance, he resolved to take them all. Engrossed in his task, he failed to hear approaching footsteps. As he stepped back from the now flowerless rose bush, he sensed a presence watching him. Turning around, he encountered a stern-looking figure glaring at him. The individual, resembling a human but with a wild tangle of facial hair and an unusually tall, muscular frame, appeared enraged. Clearly caught off guard, the person was clad in rumpled linen attire, as if hastily summoned. The furious expression on his face was unmistakable. "What do you think you are doing?" he growled loudly, resembling a wolf. Laurent stood frozen, acutely conscious of the bouquet in his left hand. He stuttered out an explanation, claiming he believed the house was uninhabited and that the roses wouldn't be missed. Seeing no change in the man's intimidating expression, he weakly added that he had promised roses to his daughter. The man in the linen shirt, with a beastly demeanor, waited in silence, as if carefully choosing his words. Standing tall, he declared, "You took advantage of my hospitality without permission. You ate my dinner, you slept in my chair, all of which I was willing to overlook without confronting you. However, you've now taken every bloom from my most prized rose bush. Each of those flowers holds great personal significance to me, and they are irreplaceable. I insist that you make amends for this." Upon hearing this, Laurent's heart sank. He shook his head in resignation, confessing that he had nothing to offer in compensation. The stern host regarded him coldly. "In that case, you must work to repay your debt," he stated. "I require laborers here at my estate." Laurent stared at him, attempting to propose an alternative. "But sir," he objected, "I have 6 children at home. I cannot stay here. What will happen to them?" Unmoved, the man replied, "Either you work off your debt, or someone from your family must take your place. Take your roses. They are of no use to me now. Go back to your family and make arrangements. I expect you or a replacement to arrive within a week. If you fail to appear, I will come for you," the fierce-looking man said. turning and striding towards the house without looking back. Laurent watched him vanish into the chateau. With no other choice, he headed home to inform his children of his actions. Uncertain of the future, he resolved to make provisions for them in his absence. Perhaps once the man had calmed down, he would reconsider and not keep Laurent away for too long. Riding steadily but slowly, he pondered the news he would have to deliver. Despite the beautiful day, with the mist clearing and the autumn sun shining brightly, his heart was heavy, and he felt apprehensive about what lay ahead. He arrived home late that night. His children greeted him with excitement. After all, they were expecting gifts. Opening and closing his saddlebags, they playfully reached around to find the finery he had promised them. With regret, he instead offered each of them a rose. Camille took hers and smelled it with delight, admiring its perfection. But his other 5 children demanded to see their real presents. That night, around the crowded kitchen table, Laurent told his children what had happened on his ill-fated journey to the port city. He related the loss of his remaining fortune, as well as the circumstances leading up to his current obligation to the owner of the mysterious chateau. When he concluded that he would have to return and work off his debt, the 5 oldest siblings were not pleased. They pouted, asking how they were supposed to manage in his absence. Camille alone was silent. She sat at the table with an unreadable expression, lost in thought. Finally, she called for silence. Her siblings looked at her with surprise, as Camille was usually not one to insert her opinion. Camille announced that she would return to the chateau to take her father's place. Laurent's eyes filled with tears. He protested that he could not and would not allow such a thing. However, Camille's sound reasoning was difficult to counter. Father was needed at home to support the family. She, however, could be spared. Furthermore, she did have some household skills and would be able to do whatever cleaning or cooking was allotted to her. No, she concluded, there was not another reasonable solution. She was who would work off the family debt. It took a day or 2 for Camille to prepare her modest belongings for the journey. As the rose her father brought her began to wilt, she pressed it in a book to dry. She wanted to have a reminder of why she was leaving home to work for this beastly stranger on a distant and isolated estate. Camille was nervous about leaving behind everything she had known, but she was determined to make her father proud. The morning of Camille's departure dawned bright and clear. She and Laurent packed her things into a small cart that they hitched to their faithful mare. The chateau would be 2 days' walk with the horse pulling the cart. Laurent knew of an inn where they could spend the night along the way. Her 4 remaining siblings gathered in front of the cottage to see them off. Among them, there was a mixture of relief and unspoken admiration. They were glad that they would not be left to fend for themselves for very long. It was a somber journey for Laurent and Camille. The fine weather lasted all the first day, and their night at an inn was uneventful. The second day of their journey turned out to be blustery and somber, as autumn began to assert itself in the forest. The first brown leaves had fallen and were blown across their path, while the wind whistled through the trees. Their trusty mare plodded along the road slowly, bringing them closer to their separation. When Laurent noticed the turnoff from the main road that led to the chateau, his heart broke a little more with each step. Sensing her father's dwindling spirits, Camille gathered her courage and offered him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, father," she said soothingly. "I am capable. I will manage." He nodded, hoping it would prove true. Eventually, they reached the dreary entrance of the estate. Laurent knew the moment had arrived. Once again, pushing the gate open, he guided the horse through and approached the imposing mansion for the second time. Camille gazed openly at the sight before her. The elaborate, overgrown gardens and the towering, unforgiving walls of the house were more grandiose than anything she had ever seen. It was overwhelming, yet also striking in its starkness. Coming from a village background, Camille was left speechless by the sheer magnitude of the place and felt deeply the mystery and permanence it exuded. The stones themselves seemed to slumber, as if they had long awaited rediscovery in secret. She pondered the tasks that awaited her here, hoping they were within her capabilities. Bringing the horse and cart to a halt, Laurent, once the keeper of a modest cottage, stopped at the broad front steps. The wind gusted sideways, as if trying to push them away from the entrance. They ascended slowly. Laurent raised the weighty door knocker and let it fall. Father and daughter stood at the steps, waiting for the stern master of the house to appear. To their surprise, the door creaked open slowly, revealing a boy. He seemed to be around 13 years old and was dressed plainly in village attire. Peering out, he observed the pair with open curiosity. Satisfied with his assessment, he nodded. "Is one of you the new servant, then?" he inquired. Laurent was momentarily taken aback, but indicated that he had brought his daughter Camille, who would be working off his debt in his place. The boy nodded, as if this was entirely expected, and pulled hard on the door, gesturing for her to enter. With that, the voice scuttled off into the recesses of the house, presumably to announce that the new servant waited with the wind at her back. Camille walked through the doorway and into her new life. It was an emotional parting for Laurent and Camille, but they both put on a brave face. The faithful mare turned homeward, the sullen skies weighing down on them, and did not look back until they were outside the gates of the chateau. Then, the swaying trees of the forest closed in behind them. Camille stood uncertainly in the echoing hallway. The gray light of the overcast day made its way into the room via tall windows above the door, but it did nothing to create a feeling of warmth. She suppressed a shiver, edging closer to the trunk that held her belongings. She told herself she would need to muster her courage and do her best. After a few minutes, the boy came running back into the hall and announced to her that the Baron had told him to take her to her room. With that, he cheerfully picked up her trunk and began lugging it up the large, curving staircase. Camille followed him, surprised that she was going up instead of down to a kitchen or lower room. Perhaps she would be lodging in the attic. To her surprise, the boy turned down the first grand hallway they padded along the richly carpeted east wing of the chateau. Their silent steps moved past, staring portraits of nobles from bygone eras. It was as if they were a permanent residence, and this strange girl was an unexpected intruder. Camille was so busy looking at them that she almost collided with the boy when he finally stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. Camille followed him inside and was surprised to find herself standing in the most well-appointed bedroom she'd ever seen. It was not overly large, and the furnishings were sober, but the canopied bed, the fine fabrics, and the rich wood trim were very luxurious. While she surveyed the room, noting a cozy window seat and small dressing table, the boy announced and started a fire in the grate. When it was crackling, he stood and dusted off his hands, grinning at her. "I'm Gabriel," he said, "and I help the Baron out around here with this and that. I'm so glad you've come. It does get a bit solitary sometimes, and I could use some help with the day-to-day." Camille wasn't sure how to respond, although she wondered what exactly the day-to-day was instead. She thanked him for the fire and asked when she would be meeting her new employer. Gabriel informed her that the Baron had indicated he would see her tomorrow, and that he'd explain her duties then. For now, the boy would be bringing her a simple supper, and hoped she would rest well for the night. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, Gabriel left the room and closed the door silently behind him. Camille collected herself and began to unpack her belongings. She hung her clothes in the spacious wardrobe and placed her few books carefully on a side table next to the bed. Opening the top book, she noticed a pink rose tucked between the pages, which brought a bittersweet smile to her face. After closing the book and setting it aside, she walked over to the window, drew back the heavy drapes, and settled into the plush cushions of the window seat. From this vantage point, she had a commanding view of the courtyard, where gardens sprawled untamed along the pathways and up the stone walls of the chateau. Dusk was approaching, and the wind stirred debris across the paved yard, creating small whirlwinds here and there. Dark clouds raced past the ascending moon. Overwhelmed by the journey and the unfamiliarity of her new surroundings, she drifted off briefly, enveloped by the curtains. A knock on her door roused her. Disentangling herself from the window seat, she regulated her breathing and opened the door. Outside, a tray awaited her, bearing a simple dinner of bread, cheese, soup, and hot tea. Surveying the hallway, she saw no one. Gabriel moved with stealth, that much was clear. Bringing the tray inside, she placed it on a small table near the fireplace. Feeling famished, she devoured every morsel. With little preparation for bed, she pulled back the coverlet, slipped into the cozy embrace of her sheets and pillow, and swiftly succumbed to sleep. During the night, Camille experienced peculiar dreams. She envisioned herself wandering the dim corridors of the chateau, trailing a large dog that vanished into various rooms, only to reappear in the hallway moments later. Striving to catch up, she arrived at a doorway where the dog had just disappeared. Peering into the room, she encountered not a dog, but the back of a man seated at a desk. As he began to swivel in his chair to face her, she awoke abruptly. Sitting up in bed, she noticed the dwindling firelight and the sunlight streaming through her window as her initial confusion dissipated. As she gathered her bearings, a knock sounded at her door. Outside stood Gabriel with a tray. "Good morning, Miss Me," he greeted politely. "I have brought you some breakfast." Gesturing towards the entrance, he informed her, "The Baron requests your presence in his study once you have finished." Camille acknowledged the boy, accepted the tray, and watched as he vanished once more. An hour later, Camilla stood nervously at the door of the very room where her father had once eaten his stolen fireside dinner. Camille could hear paper shuffling around inside. She cleared her throat and knocked lightly on the door. The noises stopped, and she heard a chair scraping across the floor. Momentarily, a man with a copious amount of facial hair appeared. His features were unattractively prominent, and his face appeared to wear a natural scowl. He was a truly alarming sight, but Camille took care not to reveal her feelings. He dipped her head politely in greeting. The huge man peered at her appraisingly and nodded his ungainly head in return. Then he gestured for her to be seated in a chair by the fire. He lowered himself into the armchair opposite. "See that you are the one to work off your father's debt," he said. "Are you familiar with basic household tasks, such as cleaning and some cooking?" Camille nodded, indicating that she was. The man appeared pleased by this. He lifted a heavy ring of keys off a nearby table. "As you can see, I am very short on help here," he said. "Gabriel takes care of my basic needs. His mother keeps me provisioned with bread, milk, and eggs each day, and he runs errands to town. But there is nobody else to manage the estate other than myself. I'm sure you can tell that by looking around. It's still too much work, just you and Gabriel, but we will make do." He paused, as if waiting for a reply. Camille was aghast at the idea of being the only housekeeper in this huge mansion, but she didn't think there was a point in saying so. The man continued, "These keys will open most rooms in the house, although there is little reason to use many of them. If you need something that Gabriel cannot get for you, please speak to me. Otherwise, I am not particular, and would like you to make as many household decisions for yourself as possible. I spend most of my time in my study or in the library." Overwhelmed by the enormity of the job he was giving her, Camille could only nod, indicating that the interview was at an end. He stood abruptly. Camille rose from her seat, took the ancient-looking keys from him, and nodded. Then, as she made her way out of the room, he called after her, "Dinner is at 7 p.m. It would be very sensible if you would join me in the dining room." Camille bobbed her head, thanked him, and left the study. She stood somewhat bewildered in the echoing front hall, feeling at once that she was lost in it, and also that it was closing in on her. Spreading the heavy keys across her open palm, she gazed at them reflectively. She didn't know what doors they opened, but they held a quiet aura of authority about them. She was stirred from her reverie by the sight of Gabriel emerging from the shadows. Grinning brightly in her direction, he asked if she would like a tour. She gratefully accepted, and so her adventure of being the housekeeper at the chateau began. What Camille discovered was that the employer lived in solitude for many years due to his intimidating appearance, causing the local people to fear him. They spread unkind rumors and treated him disrespectfully when he appeared in public. Gabriel was the only person who maintained his connection to the outside world. He had initially started by running errands for the Baron years ago, but he had grown to admire and care for the man behind the unapproachable facade. He assured Camille that the Baron's harsh demeanor was not a true reflection of his character. Gabriel now spent each day at the residence, attending to necessary tasks. At night, he returned to his family's modest home on the outskirts of town. Truly, "Miss," he insisted, "the Baron is a just and compassionate man." Gabriel guided Camille through the numerous rooms and corridors of the entire chateau, which showed signs of neglect in most areas. Along the dim passageways were unused bedrooms draped in dust sheets. The fireplaces lay dormant, with some rooms untouched for decades or even centuries. Accumulated furniture and belongings were cloaked in cobwebs. The windows barely let in light from outside, obscured by years of grime. Camille soon realized that only a handful of rooms were in regular use, and that she needed to focus on cleaning and organizing those spaces. These included the kitchen, the Baron's study, and the main entrance. However, the most remarkable room was the library. Gabriel granted Camille a glimpse into the library while the Baron was occupied elsewhere, and she was amazed by what she saw. A vast room with lofty ceilings and gilded accents unfolded before her. Bookshelves extended to the ceiling, lining every inch of the walls except where windows were situated. Rolling ladders stood at each end of the room, poised to glide across the bookcases and grant access to any volume. The sheer number of books was overwhelming. Their spines displayed various hues of crimson, forest green, navy blue, and brown, each beckoning to be plucked from the shelf and perused. Camille, an enthusiastic reader despite her limited access to books following her father's financial downfall, had never encountered or envisioned a collection as extensive as this one. According to Gabriel, the Baron devoted a significant amount of time to the library, a claim that seemed evident. Tables scattered throughout this opulent retreat were laden with volumes left open to specific pages or grouped together, while well-worn leather armchairs hinted at prolonged hours spent leafing through their weighty pages. Gabriel instructed her solemnly to ensure the fireplace remained lit in the grand room during the day. Camille envisioned the experience of selecting one of these countless volumes and sinking into a plush chair, inhaling the fragrance of aged, ink-stained paper. It was captivating. Camille understood that the key to making headway in this neglected residence was simply to select a starting point and commence the task. On that initial day, she and Gabriel dusted and aired the front hall and tidied up the kitchen. Although Gabriel and the Baron had been preparing basic meals there for quite some time, a significant portion of the space required attention. Camille wasn't a culinary expert, but she found joy in restoring the kitchen's sparkle. She dispatched Gabriel to the town with a shopping list. Then, in the grand silent kitchen, she got to work. Unused countertops were cleared of dust, pots and pans were polished, and the cold, empty space gradually regained vitality. By the time she was ready to dine with the Baron, she'd cooked a modest meal of roasted chicken. It was simple, yet she felt a sense of pride in it. With little time to freshen up, Camille returned to her room. Gabrielle had reignited the fire, and she used her pitcher and washstand to tidy up, donning her finest dress. As she approached the window to draw the curtains for the night, she paused and gazed out into the darkness. The courtyard lay silent, as if anticipating something. Nothing moved, not even a bird. It seemed as though the grounds were enveloped in a spell of quietude. Thoughtfully gathering the velvet curtains together, she tore her gaze away from the window. There was much to discover about this place, she mused. Lighting a candle, She proceeded down the dimly lit hallway and descended the broad staircase, the tall doors of the dining room. The room was exceedingly grand for just 2 individuals. It had undoubtedly hosted lavish gatherings and formal dinners. Glancing upward, she admired the gleaming crystal chandelier that hung over the room like a starry canopy. Gabriel had set 2 places at one end of the lengthy table, and dinner was ready. She was the first to arrive. She didn't have to wait long. The Baron's imposing figure awkwardly appeared in the doorway. Pausing briefly, he nodded in greeting. He gestured towards the 2 place settings, indicating she should take a seat. Camille gladly settled into one of the upholstered chairs. "I see you and Gabriel have been hard at work today," the Baron remarked, raising his eyebrows at the hearty meal she had prepared. "He has carried a heavy load as my sole help in recent years. I'm pleased that you are here to share some of his burdens." Camille nodded, uncertain how to respond. "You are my lord," she began, but he shook his head. "Please, just call me Antoine," he replied. "I am lord of nothing now, merely the lord of this chateau and its collection of dusty relics," he quipped darkly. Looking into her eyes, he said, "I apologize for the circumstances that brought you here, but I hope you will find comfort. I strive to be fair, and I appreciate your company." Camille nodded and briefly smiled. "Would you like me to organize the library tomorrow?" she inquired. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to enter." After a moment of thought, the Baron nodded and approved the idea. He then added, "Feel free to borrow any book you like from the room. As Descartes said, reading good books is akin to conversing with the greatest minds of past centuries. You will find that my library holds a vast collection of books, perhaps even those you've only heard of. It is quite magical in that sense." Taken aback by his gracious gesture and refined manner, Camille observed her somewhat unassuming employer as he dined. Having been at the chateau for only a day, her perspective on her situation had already begun to shift. She now found herself the mistress of a grand estate, with the freedom to work as she pleased, and she had just been granted access to an extensive library. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events would not be as bleak as she had feared. Quietly contemplating her plate in the flickering firelight, she could only hear the clinking of silverware against china. Throughout the dinner, the Baron and Camille exchanged few words, finishing their meal in respectful silence. Later, as she lay comfortably nestled in the crisp white sheets of her luxurious canopy bed, Camille felt a sense of optimism. This secluded estate held many intriguing secrets, and she eagerly anticipated uncovering them in due time. Rolling over onto her side, she drowsily gazed at the tightly drawn drapes, shutting out the darkness of the night beyond the window. Within the walls of this chateau a warmth emanated, a flame that she could sense. The following day, after tidying up the kitchen, Camille cautiously made her way to the library. Knowing that the Baron was occupied in his other study, she saw an opportunity to explore the magnificent collection of books under the pretense of cleaning. Armed with a duster, she systematically moved around the piles of books and tables, attending to neglected surfaces that had gathered dust over time. Just as she was about to shift some stacked volumes, Antoine appeared in the doorway. Please refrain from disturbing any stacks or opening books, he requested. Camille apologized, stepping back from the pile she had touched. No need to apologize, he reassured her. I understand it may seem disorganized. I am in the midst of research and wouldn't want to lose my place. Then, he inquired if she had selected a book for herself. She replied that she hadn't and asked for his recommendations. Camille confessed that she felt inadequate to grasp such significant works, coming from a less educated background than him. Antoine smiled, gestured broadly, and remarked, recognizing one's ignorance is the first step towards wisdom. Noticing her perplexity, he playfully winked and attributed that piece of wisdom to Socrates. Crossing the room, he retrieved a small volume from a lower shelf and handed it to her carefully. Perhaps you might enjoy some of his other musings. He advocated strongly for questioning things. Camille accepted the book with a grateful nod. I was about to leave the room, she began, but then turned back, revealing that she did have a question. Could I arrange for some villagers to come and tidy the gardens before winter? She inquired. Antoine regarded her somewhat sadly and shrugged. If Gabriel manages to find anyone willing to set foot on the estate, you're welcome to do so. Unfortunately, most are fearful of entering the chateau's grounds due to the outlandish tales that have circulated about me over the years, which is why I find myself mostly alone. Camille furrowed her brow. How do you endure it? Doesn't it anger you to be treated so unjustly? The Baron looked down contemplatively and replied, I used to be a more attractive, yet vain and foolish man. It took a great misfortune for me to realize my mistakes and the disdain people hold for me. Perhaps it is just retribution for my past foolishness. Camille remained silent, deciding not to pose any more inquiries that day. But she was determined to uncover more about how her employer had fallen into such a dire state. For now, she looked forward to delving into Socrates' writings in her room after dinner. Camille swiftly adapted to her new role as the chateau's housekeeper, and eventually grew to cherish it. Through some persuasion, she convinced Gabriel to hire a few local men who arrived at the estate one day and cleared the gardens of years of neglect. However, this was only after Camille had given them strict instructions not to damage the rose bush by the pergola, as it had been planted by Antoine's mother and held great sentimental value to him. She almost regretted bringing the village men to the house when she overheard them speaking disparagingly about Antoine. He's a complete monster, one of them exclaimed loudly to the other. Lives like a wild animal in there, added another. No manners and not fit for human company, but I'll take his money, the man finished rudely. Observing Antoine standing by the window, listening to the entire conversation, Camille hurried to close it, eager to shield him from the men's cruelty. He waved her off, seemingly unperturbed. I'm accustomed to this kind of talk, he remarked. It has been many years since I could socialize in society. Camille was still upset. How can you tolerate such unfairness? People who don't even know you. How do you not loathe them? She asked. He shrugged, gazing thoughtfully at a stack of books on a nearby table. A great English playwright named William Shakespeare once wrote, "Not a furnace for your foe so hot that it do singe yourself by bearing goodwill for these unknowing people I ease the burden on myself." when he smiled and nodded at Camille, saying, "Might like to read Shakespeare yourself. He wrote some excellent plays." And with that, he turned back to his stack of books, leaving Camille to consider his words in the dreary day outside. Despite the large amount of work that waited to be done each day, Camille still made time to explore the house. As autumn properly set in with its crisp days, early sunsets, and chilly evenings, she would wander the corridors with a candle, using her heavy ring of house keys to find out what was behind the myriad closed doors that lined the halls. Most of them were bedrooms. It was obvious that this country chateau had once hosted many fine guests of the nobility. Now covered in dust sheets, one darkened room after another revealed elegant four-poster beds, expensive furniture, and dusty fabric-covered chairs. One day, she found what appeared to be a very special room. It had clearly been a lady's chamber, unlike the other ones. However, it was still full of her belongings. A graceful dressing table was covered with jars of powder and perfume bottles that twinkled in the afternoon sunlight. Elaborate wigs of the type worn decades ago sat nearby on their own stands, as if waiting to be taken to a ball. Opening the wardrobe, Camille was astounded to find a row of decadent silk dresses in the fashion of the time before the Revolution. She ran her hand lightly over their delicate skirts, almost afraid that they would disintegrate in her fingers. She imagined the elegant woman who must have worn them. Upon opening the chest of drawers, she discovered it was filled with shimmering necklaces. Inside a small velvet container, there was a ring adorned with a sparkling sapphire. Camille closed the box gently, ensuring she did not give the impression of stealing. With a sense of regret, she quietly pushed the drawer back in and left the room, locking it behind her. The contents felt like a gateway to happier days, and were the most exquisite items she had seen in the house. Camille diligently wrote letters to her father, which Gabriel would deliver to town when he ran errands. In her letters, she reassured her father that she was being treated well and enjoyed her work. Eventually, she was able to start sending him some money. After her first month, the Baron informed her that he could not allow her to work without pay, as the damage to the rosebush had been adequately compensated for. He expressed his desire for her to stay and offered her a weekly salary for her efforts, which Camille gratefully accepted. As Antoine's housekeeper, she felt she had found her true calling. Her organizational skills were put to good use, and she found great joy in the pleasant company and access to his remarkable library. Despite Antoine's reputation for being unattractive, Camille hardly noticed any change in him, except for ensuring his clothes were well maintained and presentable. Occasionally, she would catch a glimpse of a normal, handsome man in the mirror as he passed by, or during conversations when his features appeared more harmonious and less covered in hair. However, after blinking a few times and refocusing, she would see him as the same intimidating figure as before. It seemed as though the dark magic of the chateau was playing tricks on her mind. With a hint of amusement, she recalled how occasionally a beggar would arrive at the door, unaware of the estate's infamous reputation in her hometown. Beggars were typically turned away and received little assistance due to the villagers' belief that they deserved their plight and that hard-working individuals did not end up in such destitution. Camille had anticipated that Antoine would dismiss them, but instead he surprised her by requesting that she hand over the handsome coins before their departure. Curious, Camille inquired about his act of kindness, noting that no one in the vicinity had shown him any goodwill. Once again, he cited a revered philosopher he admired, Aristotle, quoting, "It is the characteristic of the magnanimous man to ask no favor, but to be ready to do kindness to others." Somberly, he acknowledged, "I must learn to be a more magnanimous man because it is my past actions that led me to ruin." Despite her curiosity, Camille couldn't extract any further explanation from him at that moment, but she longed to comprehend what had befallen Antoine. Later that evening, they engaged in friendly conversation in the candle-lit dining room while enjoying a hearty winter stew. It was then that Camille gathered the courage to inquire about Antoine's solitude at the chateau. Antoine hesitated, let out a deep sigh, leaned back in his chair, and after taking a long sip of his drink, he began recounting a tale. Antoine recounted how he had lived at the chateau with his mother many years ago. After his father's passing, he became the lord of the estate. He cherished his mother, describing her as a beautiful person who was both the life of the party and kind to all. It was his mother's rose bush that Camille's father had stripped of its blooms. Uncomfortably, Antoine continued, revealing that after his mother's death, he spiraled into a reckless lifestyle. He wasted the family fortune on extravagant items and lavish parties, neglected the estate, left debts unpaid, and mistreated his staff. Without his mother's guidance, he lost his way and became worthless to himself and others. One evening, a woman came to the door seeking food and money, but Antoine callously dismissed her, consumed by his own vanity. The woman prophesied that he would live a lonely and unloved life, with his only hope for redemption lying in embracing humanity. Perplexed, Camille questioned Antoine about the meaning of humanity. Antoine admitted that it was a puzzle he had grappled with for years. Despite having access to a vast collection of books by esteemed philosophers, mathematicians, and poets in his library, he had yet to find a solution to his predicament. Although his intellect had grown, he remained trapped by an unknown enchantment, unable to find the key to his liberation within the wisdom of humanity. Camille regarded him from across the table. She could hear the light crackling of the fire punctuating the silence, and imagined him sitting before many fires for a long time without anyone to talk to. She wondered how many years he'd been trapped here in this solitary prison, turning the pages of countless books in his library, searching for redemption. Antoine smiled brightly in an attempt to break the awkward silence. "Oh, well," he added, "thus the excellent Isaac Newton said, to arrive at the simplest truth requires years of contemplation. One of these days, I may yet find the answer lying cowled up on her bed that night." Camille felt she had finally put the pieces together. All these years, Antoine had spent his time studying, thinking, absorbing, and repenting. He was no longer a man who would refuse kindness to even the undeserving. She did wonder what else there was that he could do. Would he forever be trapped here with his books and the dusty souvenirs of the regrettable person he used to be? She hoped not, because she had really come to admire him. She pulled the covers, tied her around her chin, and gazed drowsily at the remnants of the fire glowing in the hearth. Surrounded by the silence of the house, she slept for another night. All through the crisp, deep freeze of winter, Camille and Antoine went about their lives at the chateau, in pleasant companionship with Gabriel as their faithful connection to the outside world. Many of the rooms in the enormous mansion stayed locked and unused. The part of the house the trio needed for their daily activities was snug and clean, thanks to Camille's faithful management. Meals were simple but hearty. The blinding white snow piled high in the courtyard, and sometimes the bleak wind whistled in the abandoned passages. But the inhabitants of the chateau stayed close to the fireplaces, buried in their books. At last, the first signs of spring arrived with it. Camille received a letter from her father. He said her oldest sister had managed to make a marriage match, and that her wedding would take place in a couple of weeks. He asked if the Baron would consider allowing her to take some leave in order to attend the festivities at home. If so, Laurent would be pleased to come and fetch her from the estate. When Camille presented this request to Antoine, he put down his book, gazed at her with a sad smile, and said, "Of course, she must go and she should take all the time she needs." As she thanked him for giving his permission, she once again did not see a beast looking back at her. She only saw a man. She had to blink several times to dispel the illusion. As she left the room, she paused briefly, gazed at him again over her shoulder. Then she left him to his reading, putting the moment behind her. Her journey to and from her sister's wedding was uneventful. Family greeted her with much curiosity, and perhaps some newfound respect. They admired the tasteful new clothes she acquired using her salary. It was obvious that the money she was sending to them had helped secure her sister's marriage. Humble though the match might be, her family was no longer seen by the villages as being impoverished. Instead, they were viewed as being stable and acceptable, thanks to her regular income. And yet, Camille felt less at home in the family cottage than she once had. Although she had been contained inside the walls of the chateau this entire time, she felt like her worldview had changed, and her horizons had vastly expanded. Seated around the fire with her siblings who focused only on their own petty concerns, she felt stifled. She regretted having to leave her father again, but Camille also felt relief when he parted from her at the gates of Antoine's estate. She was ready to return to her life as mistress of the house. Her happiness, however, turned to dismay when she saw the disarray that awaited her. Gabriel answered the door eagerly, obviously delighted that she'd returned. He whispered to her that nothing had been the same since she'd left, and that the Baron was disheveled and did not leave his library. After putting away her things, Camille went straight to see Antoine. As she cautiously opened the door to the library, she found her room in a complete mess. Books were everywhere, lying open in stacks, generally tossed about. On the floor, empty drinking glasses lined the tables. Antoine sat slumped in a chair, looking as if he hadn't changed his shirt in days, and the sound of her arrival. However, he looked up with an expression of sheepish relief. Once again, in this moment, Camille felt she only saw him as a regular man, and she struggled to adjust her view. She knew logically that she was standing before an unkempt, unshaven, and rather beastly person. However, Her eyes were playing tricks. It took a moment before she saw him properly again. Yes, there he was in dire need of cheering up. It only took a few days for Camille to set everything right again. Dust and neglect of a couple of weeks were easily dealt with, and the Baron's mood improved instantly upon her return. Gabriel begged her in confidence, however, to go away again. He said the Baron had sunk immediately into the most terrible melancholy, and had been completely useless about managing anything at all, including remembering to eat his meals. With spring blasting out all over the estate, it was impossible to be sad for long. Camille was overjoyed that she had arranged for the garden to be cleared before winter. The courtyard looked absolutely stunning, with the beautiful plantings originally designed by Antoine's mother many years ago now shining at their best. A variety of colorful flowers delicately presented themselves, while the birds seemed to be multiplying daily, singing sweetly in the mornings, and inviting the chateau residents to spend time in the garden. Camille and Antoine started to enjoy their afternoons reading outside in the pergola, and he often let Gabriel finish his tasks early so they could spend the afternoon with friends. Camille also took pleasure in opening the windows of the stuffy mansion to let in fresh air. Life throughout the estate began to feel rejuvenated, as if a new chapter had begun. As summer approached, Camille received another message from her father informing her that her other sister was getting married once again, and she was invited to the wedding. Camille felt torn. While she felt obligated to be with her family for the wedding, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving Antoine once more. Faced with this dilemma, she came up with an unconventional plan. She proposed to Antoine that he accompany her to the wedding, stay at a nearby inn, and attend the event. Antoine was shocked by the idea. "Have you not seen how people react to me?" he questioned. Camille had anticipated this, and pointed out that her village was far away, and people there wouldn't have preconceived notions about him. Privately, Camille no longer saw him as a monster. She only saw the wise, kind man she had grown to love. She believed that the people back home would give him a fair chance. The idea of a lord attending a village wedding didn't bother Camille. She had long stopped seeing Antoine as either a beast or a baron. Despite his reluctance, Antoine eventually agreed, not wanting to be the reason Camille missed her sister's wedding. However, he appeared apprehensive and was in a somber mood as the preparations moved forward. Camille was determined and sent Gabriel to the tailor in town to request a new, well-fitted suit for Antoine. She had noticed that he was still wearing outdated styles from decades ago. The current trend favored cleaner and simpler attire. She wanted him to have a dignified suit that would make him look less like a relic. Rooms in which we had been engaged were prepared, and the carriage was cleaned. Eventually, the day arrived when Gabriel bid the couple farewell on their journey. He had never witnessed the Baron leaving the estate before. He assured them that he would prevent everything from falling apart in their absence. The trip to Camille's village was swift by carriage, covering the distance in just a day, which turned out to be a beautiful one. Summer was displaying its lush vibrancy as the horse trotted down the road through the forest. The sun shone joyfully through the canopy of leaves above them, casting bright rays of sunshine on the path ahead, whispering enchantingly in the breeze. Initially, Antoine was silent, seemingly resisting the fact that he was accompanying Camille in public. However, after a few miles, he engaged in conversation about a book Camille had been reading, and soon their usual lively banter resumed. Camille smiled to herself, witnessing his best qualities emerge. Observing him from the side, she could have sworn she was sitting next to a charming gentleman, content with that notion. She did not try to dispel the enchantment. Their pleasant journey eventually came to an end as twilight descended, and the crickets began their nightly serenade in the fields. Antoine and Camille arrived at her family's cottage and stopped the carriage. As they alighted, her entire family stood at the front door, her 4 unmarried siblings staring rudely at them. Laurent made a more concerted effort to compose himself. He stepped forward, nodding politely to Antoine and expressing gratitude for bringing Camille and honoring them with his visit. However, Camille felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment when her brother loudly whispered something to her older sister, causing the girl to giggle. It was evident to all that they were making jokes about the Baron. Everyone felt relieved when Antoine departed for his lodgings. Camille allowed herself to be ushered inside, where she spent the evening conversing with Laurent and her siblings, politely inquiring about the wedding preparations. She was concerned, though, about how Antoine was faring at the inn, and hoped he was not encountering any mistreatment there. As she lay her head on her pillow that night, thoughts of him weighed heavily on her mind. She realized she would be glad when they had gotten through this wedding and returned to the chateau, which she now felt was her real home. It was grim when he arrived at the church the next day for the wedding. It was obvious that Camille's fears had come true. They sat in silence during the ceremony, both feeling as if they were being stared at the entire time. The small church felt tiny, with the whole congregation scrutinizing them. The celebration afterward was on the village green. The party was simple, but festive with punch, cakes, and wildflowers. A happy atmosphere prevailed as ladies gathered in groups delicately eating sweets, while children tumbled across the lawn, enjoying an afternoon of play. Camille and Antoine, however, did not feel part of the celebration. She stood at his side stiffly, nodding to the villagers who had once been so kind to her. The welcoming people who had taught her to garden and bake years ago were now standing at a distance, whispering behind their hands and nodding knowingly in her direction. Not one neighbor had a polite word for Antoine, who smiled at all and said nothing. Her family was no help. They ignored the pair completely. As Camille and Antoine stood fervently wishing for the party to end, they overheard 2 men speaking nearby. "You may have money," one said with a smirk, "but he'll never convince anyone to marry him with a face like that." The other man laughed. "Sad state of affairs when you have to court your own maid," he responded. Those words were the last straw. Camille put down her punch and walked to the center of the gathering, tersely announcing that she had something to say and that everyone must listen. "I convinced the Baron to come with me because I thought you to be good people," she said. "I was sure that his fine character and his kindness would make it obvious to you all that he is not the beast people make him out to be. Well, I'm ashamed to say that I was wrong. None of you are worthy of his notice. We will trouble you no longer. Let me tell you this. Antoine is a better man than any other here. I would choose him as a companion over every single one of you, 100 times over, and that's the truth. The company was completely silent, looking in bewilderment from Camille to Antoine and back again. As she turned to face him, she saw the strangest thing. Where he had stood, a handsome, dignified man stood smiling gratefully in her direction. No matter how many times she tried to adjust her view, clear her head, his visage did not change. The excess of facial hair, the overly prominent features, and the massive proportions would not return. He was as handsome as any man she had ever known, and that remained unchanged. Whether it was a shift in perspective or the result of an enchantment, the other party guests appeared to be carrying on with their festivities as if nothing had occurred. They warmly greeted Antoine and smiled at Camille as if everything was perfectly normal. It seemed as though the entire embarrassing incident had never taken place. The villagers behaved as if they had never before encountered a beast in their midst. It was both puzzling and miraculous. The veil had been lifted permanently. This quiet moment of triumph marked Antoine's final release from the enchantment. For years, he had sought answers in his library, delving into the wisdom of humanity. However, he had misunderstood the woman who had cursed him. The lonely decades of growing kinder, more generous, and more forgiving had instilled in him the humanity that had captured Camille's heart. This was the missing piece that had broken the curse. Shortly after, Camille and Antoine sat together beneath the pergola in his garden, admiring his mother's rose bush, which was once again blooming abundantly. Twilight descended upon the chateau, and the crickets emerged to serenade the world. As the happy couple savored the balmy summer evening, Camille observed this new, joyful Antoine, appreciating the handsome face that had long been hidden behind the beastly facade. As she watched, he sat up straighter and reached into his pocket, producing the very ring she had secretly admired in his mother's dresser. "You were the only person who made the effort to truly understand me," he said to her. Then, in his own way, he recited a quote from one of his many books. As Copernicus said, "In the middle of everything is the sun. You have become that sun." Winking at her, he added, "After all, I believe you have proven yourself more than capable of managing this chateau." Camille laughed and nodded in agreement, allowing him to slide the sparkling blue gem onto her finger. Gazing at it in wonder, she recalled the moment she had first seen it in the mysterious bedroom among the elegant dresses and other jewels. It gleamed in the sunlight as if conveying a precious secret. She was now becoming a part of the history of this house. Before the summer's end, Antoine and Camille exchanged their vows in the chateau's courtyard, surrounded by the heavenly fragrance of the blooming rose bushes and the sweet melodies of the birds in the treetops. Standing in the house's shadow, Camille looked at Antoine with a heart full of gratitude, feeling a deep sense of belonging in a place she had once found so unfamiliar. This was no longer the desolate place she had encountered just a year ago. Through kindness, patience, and the pursuit of wisdom, she and Antoine had discovered happiness.